spending freely. Stuck at home, people have been unable to spend all their money.
Stuck at home, people have been unable to spend all their money,
And their bank balances have swelled.
and their bank balances have swelled.
But once they are
Stuck at home, people have been unable to spend all their money, and their bank balances are swelled.
vaccinated and liberated from the tyranny of Zoom, exuberant consumers may go on a spending spree.
But once they are vaccinated and liberated from the tyranny of Zoom, exuberant consumers may go on a spending spree
That outpaces the ability of firms to restore and expand their capacity.
that outpaces the ability of firms to restore and expand their capacity,
causing prices to rise.
But once they're vaccinated and liberated from the tyranny of Zoom, exuberant consumers may go on a spending spree, may go on a spending spree, may go on a spending spree that outpaces the ability of firms to restore and expand their capacity, causing prices to rise.
The global economy already shows signs of suffering from bottlenecks.
The global economy already shows signs of suffering from bottlenecks.
The global economy already shows signs of suffering from bottlenecks. The global economy already shows signs of suffering from bottlenecks. The global economy already shows signs of suffering from bottlenecks. The price of copper, for example, is 25% higher than at the start of 2020.
The price of copper, for example, is 25% higher than at the start of 2020.
The world should be able to manage such a temporary burst of inflation.
The world should be able to manage such a temporary burst of inflation.
But the second
inflationist argument
is that more persistent price pressures will also emerge
is that more persistent price pressures will also emerge
as structural disinflation pressures will also emerge as structural disinflationary forces go into reverse.
as structural disinflationary forces go into reverse.
In the West
In the West
and in Asia,
and in Asia,
many societies are aging,
many societies are aging,
creating shortages of workers.
creating shortages of workers.
For
For years,
globalization lowered inflation
globalization lowered inflation
by creating a more efficient market
by creating a more efficient market
for goods and labor.
for goods and labor.
Now, globalization is in retreat.
Now, globalization is in retreat.
Their third argument is that politicians and officials are complacent.
Their third argument is that politicians and officials are complacent.
The Federal Reserve says it wants inflation to overshoot its 2% target.
The Federal Reserve says it wants inflation to overshoot its
to overshoot its 2% target
to make up for lost ground.
The European Central Bank,
The European Central Bank,
which was expected to announce more stimulus
after we went to press,
may yet follow suit.
weighed down the need to pay for an aging population and healthcare.
Politicians will increasingly favor
Politicians will increasingly favor big budget deficit.
Might these arguments prove correct?
Might these arguments prove correct? A temporary rebound in inflation next year is perfectly possible. At first, it would be welcome. A sign the economy is recovering from the pandemic.
sign economies are recovering from the pandemic.
A sign economies are recovering from the pandemic.
It would inflate away
It would inflate away
modest amount of debt.
a modest amount of debt.
Policymakers might even breathe a sigh of relief,
Policymakers might even breathe a sigh of relief,
especially in Japan,
especially in Japan and in the Eurozone,
where prices are falling.
where prices are falling.
The rapid changes in the pattern of consumer spending
The rapid changes
prices are falling. The rapid changes in the pattern of consumer spending
in the pattern of consumer spending
may have muddied the statistics.
may have muddied the statistics.
The odds of a more sustained period of inflation
The odds of a more sustained period of inflation
remain low.
remain low.
But if central banks had to raise interest rates
But if central banks had to raise interest rates
to stop price rises getting out of hand,
to stop price rises getting out of hand,
the consequences would be serious.
the consequences would be serious.
Markets would tumble,
Markets would tumble,
and indebted firms
and indebted firms
falter.
will falter.
More important,
More important,
the full cost of the state's vastly expanded balance sheet. The full cost of the stated firms would falter. More important,
the full cost of the state's vastly expanded balance sheet.
the full cost of the state's vastly expanded balance sheets.
Both government's debt and the central bank's liabilities
Would become alarmingly apparent.
would become alarmingly apparent.
To understand why
requires peering for a moment
into how they are organized. For all the talk about locking in
into today's long-term interest rates,
government's dirty secret
is that they have been doing the opposite,
issuing short-term debt
in a bet that short-term interest rates
will remain low.
the average maturity of American treasuries,
For example,
for example,
has fallen from 70 months
has fallen from 70 months
to 63.
to 63.
Central banks have been making a similar wager
Central banks have been making a similar wager
because the reserves they create
because the reserves they create
to buy bonds carry a floating interest rate.
to buy bonds carry a floating interest rate.
They are comparable to short-term borrowing. In November,
Britain's fiscal watchdog
warned that a combination of new issuance and QE
had left the state's debt service cost
twice as sensitive
to short-term rates
as they were at the start of the year,
and nearly 3 times as much
as in 2012.
So while the probability of an inflation scare
May have risen only slightly,
its
consequences would be worse.
Countries need to ensure themselves
Against this tail risk
by reorganizing their liabilities.
Government should fund fiscal stimulus
by issuing long-term debt.
Most central banks should start an orderly reversal of QE debt.
Most central banks should start an orderly reversal of QE
and instead loosen monetary policy
by taking short-term interest rates
negative.
Financial ministries should incorporate risks
taken by the central bank
into their budgeting,
and the
and the Eurozone
should find a better tool than QE
should find a better tool than QE
for mutualizing the depth of its member states.
for mutualizing the depth of its member states.
Shortening the maturity of the state's balance sheet,
Shortening the maturity of the state's balance sheets,
as in 2020,
as in 2020,
must only ever be a last resort
must only ever be a last resort
and should not become the main tool of economic policy.
and should not become the main tool of economic policy.
The chances are that inflationistas are wrong.
Even the arch monetarist
Who inspired the wrong.
even the arch monetarist
Milton Friedman,
Milton Friedman,
who inspired Thatcher,
who inspired Thatcher,
admitted late in his life
that the short-term link
between money supply and inflation
between money supply and inflation
had broken down.
But the COVID-19 has shown the value
of preparing for rare but devastating events.
The return of inflation should be no exception.
The return of inflation should be no exception.